Geocoding in ArcGIS. I'd like to talk briefly about some of the steps and the rules for how we look at geocoding here. So the first thing to talk about is something called an address locator. And an address locator is where you define what style you're going to use, whether it's a style for zip codes or linear geocoding or address matching, and then also what is your base data that you're using as well. So either in Catalog or ArcCatalog, you go into New and choose Address Locator, and then you give it a name. The next thing you need to do is decide the address locator style. And this is basically just a skeletal format for how the geocoding process is going to work. So this is typically based on your data and your tables and then what your reference layer is. So for example, you would have the 5-digit zip code address style if your data only contains zip codes. Let's say that your data contains street addresses. There are two common address locator styles that ArcGIS uses, and I'd like to just briefly talk about these. The first style is called the US addresses dual ranges, and the other one is called US addresses single house. Now the dual ranges style is using a line data set. So for instance, if you download the Tiger files that contain lines, you would probably use this style. Or if you got the street center lines from a local jurisdiction, you would probably use this style. And the reference data set usually has an address range for both sides of the street segment. So for instance, we have a left and a right side of the street. And we also have a street segment that goes from the beginning of the street to the ending of the street. And that's all in one line file. Typically all of your addresses are in a single field, so you would have the street name, the direction, the suffix, the prefix, and the street number in one field. And so this example might be the example that I have here. Might be something like 320 Madison Street, or a county road, a number and then a county road. And so the application for this is if you want to find specifically along a street where an address is located. So ArcGIS will interpolate along that line where that address should be placed. This is similar to the example that I showed in linear address matching. And then it'll put it on either side of the street. It'll offset it to the left or to the right, depending on how far you tell it. Now the other option is US addresses single house, and this might be used if you got a point file from a local jurisdiction. So for instance, if you had a file that you got from a local county department that has just single points, this allows you to geocode to that specific address. The addresses are probably still going to be very similar to what we had with the dual ranges. All of the address elements will be in a single field, but what happens here is instead of interpolating along a line, it'll actually find that specific address or point. And sometimes this could be parcels. So maybe if you have a parcel database and you're geocoding 2 parcels, that would be an example of polygons. Or perhaps if you have buildings and you're geocoding to the buildings. So it all depends on what your base layer is, which one of these address locator styles you would choose. So after you choose your base style, then you tell it the reference data. And again, this is the data that you're going to either get from the US Census Bureau by downloading the Tiger files, and then restricting it to just the streets, or this might be street center lines that you get from a local jurisdiction, or perhaps these might be street center lines that you purchase from a vendor. So you're telling it that street layer that you have here, or if it's a polygon layer, let's say it's zip codes, this might be the polygon layer for zip codes. And then what you do is you tell it different parameters. So there are a variety of different parameters here. For instance, one might be how far do you want it to offset on your line, or do you want to set up spelling sensitivity. You could set it up so it's less sensitive to the sound X in the spelling as well. Or you could also tell it here what are the intersection connectors if you have intersections in your actual data file. So you fill out all these options here, and then you're setting that up. And by the way, you can use this address locator over and over again. So I mentioned before, if you get a product like Street Map Premium, it's going to come with pre-built address locators. So now let's go over the steps of how you're going to geocode. So you're going to create that address locator in Catalog, and then you're going to go to ArcMap and you're going to add your tabular data, That would be the data that you get from your organization, probably in a spreadsheet or a database. And you're going to also add the streets layer, or perhaps if it's a polygon zip code, you would add that layer. And then you would go and add your address locator in ArcMap. That's the address locator that you created in Catalog or ArcCatalog. And you can then go through the geocoding process. So you'll geocode your addresses, and you probably won't get 100% geocoding results. So you may have to go in and start to look at which ones matched and which ones didn't. And there is a nice process for interactively rematching addresses, and there's a window that will pop up, and you can sort by addresses that did or did not geocode, and then you would want to then figure out why those did or did not. Now typically it does take some knowledge of the local jurisdiction to be able to really accurately figure out the problems here. So if you do know people from that area where you have geocoded your addresses, you can ask them if they're familiar with the streets. Many times they'll be familiar with the local street names. But also you could use programs like Google and Google Maps and Google Earth to be able to go in and try and figure out what that street is. So very often this does take a while, depending on what the address names are and what the problems are with the geocoding, but it does give you the ability to interactively geocode and rematch. And then once you do that, you can then, depending on what the problem was, you can either just rematch automatically, or sometimes you need to fix something like a street centerline file and then rebuild the address locator. So it all depends on what the problem was for your address, the reason why your address didn't match. And then lastly, very often we ask you to create a log file. And I do this in many projects that I'm working on. If I have a project and I'm working with a researcher or a client, I will usually keep a log to say what I tried to do to match an address. And people have very often asked me, what's a good percentage for matching? It all depends on the project. Let's say that you don't have very many addresses and you want to get very specific to where something has happened. Maybe it's an event or it's a location that is very specific. You may want to take some time to really try and rematch that address. If you have hundreds of thousands of addresses and you're geocoding for a purpose that's maybe not so critical, it's not emergency management, maybe you just generally want to know where people are coming from, maybe it's not all that critical that you rematch everything, and the rematching doesn't have to be quite as precise. But again, it depends, and it's always good though to have what the incorrect address was, and then the possible reason, and if you did have a solution. So we are going to ask in the course that you do have a log file, at least for the attempt of what you tried to do when you tried to rematch some of the addresses in the examples for the assignment.